Imagine a house that looks perfectly normal, a family that seems perfectly kind. Now, imagine a secret hidden beneath the floorboards, a secret so monstrous it would make the devil himself turn away in horror. This is not a work of fiction. This is the true, documented story of Mother Sullivan and the 47 children found chained in her basement. For 20 years, she was a saint to her community, but in the darkness below, she was something else entirely. What you are about to hear is a journey into one of America's most depraved and hidden crimes, a story that proves the most terrifying monsters are the ones who look just like us. In the spring of 1834, deep within the fog-shrouded hills of central Virginia, a discovery was made that would peel back the very fabric of society, to reveal a darkness so profound, it would forever change our understanding of what human beings are capable of. This is not a ghost story. This is a story of real ghosts, the ghosts of children who were never given the chance to grow old. 47 children, not playing in a schoolyard, but found chained in a basement. Their ages were a heartbreaking spectrum, from a 6-year-old who should have been learning to read, to a 16-year-old on the cusp of adulthood. They were a random, heartbreaking collection of stolen children, a group of strangers brought together by unimaginable cruelty. When the authorities, their hands trembling with a mixture of rage and horror, finally broke through and questioned them, only one name could be whispered through their collective tears, a name that had become their entire world, their god, their tormentor, Mother Sullivan. The local sheriff's official report on this case, a document that would lie buried for over a century in the dusty, silent archives of Henrico County, described scenes so profoundly disturbing that 3 of the investigating officers, these were hardened men accustomed to the grim realities of 19th century life, resigned from their duties within a single week. They simply could not unsee what they had seen. They could not continue their work with those images burned into their minds. What makes the case of Constance Sullivan so truly haunting isn't just the immediate, gut-wrenching horror of what was found beneath that seemingly ordinary farmhouse. It's the chilling, slow-creeping realization that this woman known in her community as a pillar of charity, had been operating her twisted enterprise for over 2 decades without a single whisper of suspicion. 2 decades. Imagine the sheer number of sunrises and sunsets that passed while this horror continued, unnoticed. An entire generation of lives stolen and erased. The children called her Mother, a title meant to signify warmth, love, and protection. But the truth behind that title, the dark reality of her brand of motherhood, would prove to be far more sinister, far more monstrous than anyone in their quiet, God-fearing community could have ever dared to imagine. Before we descend further into the story of the Sullivan family and their unspeakable secrets, I want you to consider something. The journey we are about to take together is not for the faint of heart. It is for those who believe that the darkest chapters of our history must be confronted, not politely ignored. The story of Mother Sullivan is a terrifying testament to the evil that can hide in plain sight, concealed behind a carefully constructed mask of respectability. It asks us a question we must all face in our own lives, in our own communities. How well do we truly know our neighbors? The question that haunted the investigators back in 1834, the same question that continues to perplex historians to this day, is one of simple, terrifying logistics. How could such a massive, complex operation have gone completely undetected for so long in a close-knit, rural community where everyone supposedly knew everyone else's business? A place where a new horse or a failed crop was the talk of the town. The Virginia of that era was a land caught between 2 worlds. The old plantation system, with its rigid social hierarchies and its own brutal realities, still dominated the landscape, and yet whispers of industrial change, of a new, faster world, drifted down from the northern states like smoke on the wind. In this environment, the small farming community of Millbrook, a humble collection of perhaps 50 families spread across the gentle, green slopes of Henrico County, was the very definition of a typical American rural settlement. These were simple people. Most residents farmed tobacco or corn. They traded gossip and goods at Henderson's General Store, and they gathered for social events at the one-room schoolhouse that also served as their community meeting hall on Sundays. It was a world built on predictable routines, on deep familiarity, and on a quiet, unspoken trust in one another. The Sullivan property sat on the very outskirts of this community, almost as if it were deliberately keeping a watchful distance from the others. It was a modest two-story wooden farmhouse, surrounded by nearly 200 acres of prime agricultural land. To any traveler passing along the dusty, rutted road that connected Millbrook to the growing city of Richmond, the Sullivan farm would have appeared utterly, almost reassuringly, unremarkable. It was the very picture of peaceful, pastoral life. The house itself, built in the popular federal style of the early 19th century, featured the clean lines of white-painted clapboard siding and a welcoming wraparound porch, typical of Virginia architecture. A large, red-painted barn stood about 60 yards behind the house, with a chicken coop and a smokehouse completing the idyllic, almost cliché, farmstead layout. It was a scene you might see on a postcard, a perfect symbol of the simple, virtuous American dream. But what made the Sullivan property unique, what made it a place of unimaginable, hidden horror, wasn't visible from the road. It was buried deep within the Virginia earth. Ezra Sullivan, who had purchased the land back in 1809 with a substantial inheritance from his father's successful tobacco fortune, had spent considerable time, effort, and money expanding the house's basement. While most homes in the area from that period featured simple, shallow root cellars designed for storing vegetables and preserves through the winter, the Sullivan basement was a complete anomaly. It extended far beyond the actual footprint of the house above, burrowing deep into the dense clay soil like a malignant, hidden tumor. Local craftsmen from the area would later recall being hired for various separate excavation and construction projects at the farm throughout the 1810s and 1820s. They were hired to dig. They were hired to lay stone. They were hired to build thick, sound-dampening walls. Yet, not a single one of them had ever seen the completed, final work. Ezra's method was brilliantly secretive. He hired different workers and different teams for different, isolated sections of the project, ensuring that no single person ever grasped the full, horrifying scope of what was being built. He paid very well, always in cash, which was a rarity, and he only asked for two things in return: that the workers focus entirely on their small, assigned tasks, and that they ask no questions about the larger project. In a community where cash was scarce and steady work was always welcome, this was an arrangement most were more than happy to accept. The sound of their shovels digging into the earth was, unknowingly, the sound of secrets being buried deeper and deeper. Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, had arrived in Millbrook in 1811. A young and reportedly beautiful bride of 22. Neighbors from those early years remembered her as a handsome woman with dark, captivating eyes and an unusually soft, melodic voice. A voice that could soothe a crying child. A voice that could persuade a skeptical shopkeeper. A voice that could, and would, deceive an entire community for 2 decades. She dressed simply but always impeccably, attended the local Methodist church services whenever her supposed delicate health permitted, and very carefully, very deliberately, cultivated a reputation for quiet, humble charity whenever she was approached about contributing to community causes, like a collection for a new roof for the schoolhouse or providing aid for a family whose crop had failed. Constance would inevitably offer a gentle, almost apologetic refusal. She would explain, often with a sad, knowing smile, that she and Ezra were already dedicating all of their spare time and resources to caring for several orphan children. These were children, she would claim, from her own extended family back in Pennsylvania, poor souls who had nowhere else in the world to turn. The arrangement, she would always add, was only temporary. just until she could find suitable, permanent homes for them with other, more distant relatives. Imagine a house that looks perfectly normal, a family that seems perfectly kind. Now, imagine a secret hidden beneath the floorboards, a secret so monstrous it would make the devil himself turn away in horror. This is not a work of fiction. This is the true, documented story of Mother Sullivan and the 47 children found chained in her basement. For 20 years, she was a saint to her community, but in the darkness below, she was something else entirely. What you are about to hear is a journey into one of America's most depraved and hidden crimes, a story that proves the most terrifying monsters are the ones who look just like us. Monsters are the ones who look just like us. This story, delivered with such heartfelt sincerity, was the perfect explanation. It satisfied the community's natural curiosity. It explained the occasional, fleeting glimpses of small, pale faces around the Sullivan property. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, would sometimes see a young face peering out from the back of the Sullivans' covered wagon. When Constance came to town for her bi-weekly supply run, the children never spoke. They never waved. They never smiled. But Constance always had a ready explanation, her soft voice filled with practiced compassion. They were shy, she would say, still deeply traumatized by the horrific loss of their parents. They needed time, she would explain, time to adjust to their new, strange circumstances, time to heal, and the community, a community all too familiar with the constant tragedy of orphan children, in an era of high mortality rates and social upheaval, accepted these explanations without a second thought. It was a noble, Christian thing the Sullivans were doing, a true act of selfless charity. They weren't just respectable members of the community. They were saints. Thomas Henderson, the man who ran the general store, would later recall in his official testimony that Constance Sullivan was one of his most reliable, and by far his largest, customers. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, she would arrive with a detailed, handwritten list and a purse full of cash, enough to purchase substantial, almost commercial, quantities of basic foodstuffs, sacks of flour, barrels of cornmeal, large cuts of salt pork, jugs of molasses, and other staples. The quantities were enormous, far more than a simple childless couple would ever need. But when Thomas had once cautiously mentioned this, Constance had simply smiled her sad, gentle smile and reminded him of all the little mouths to feed, the ever-present, yet ever-invisible, orphan children in her care. She also purchased unusual amounts of basic medicines, tincture of laudanum for pain, bottles of castor oil, various herbal remedies for coughs and fevers. She explained that children from poor, unfortunate circumstances often arrived at her farm with a whole host of ailments that required constant, diligent treatment. Again, the explanation was perfectly logical, perfectly compassionate. It painted a vivid picture of a woman burdened by the needs of others, but blessed in her charitable spirit, a woman sacrificing her own comfort and wealth for the sake of the less fortunate. The Sullivan farm also operated on a schedule that puzzled some of the closer neighbors. While most farming families in Millbrook rose with the sun and worked their fields until dusk, activity at the Sullivan property seemed to operate on a different, more nocturnal clock. Lights could often be seen burning in the farmhouse windows at unusual, late hours, and sometimes, on still, quiet nights, the distinct sound of hammering or strange, muffled construction work would echo across the dark fields. When asked about these activities, Ezra would offer a simple, plausible explanation. He was making improvements to the house, expanding the living quarters to better accommodate the growing number of children in their benevolent care. He was a good man, a hard-working man, preparing a better, safer home for these poor orphans. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who served the Millbrook area, also remembered being called to the Sullivan farm on several occasions during the 1820s and early 1830s. Each time, the message was the same. One of the orphan children had fallen desperately ill and needed urgent medical attention. However, a strange and professionally frustrating pattern soon emerged. Dr. Whitfield was never, not a single time, permitted to actually examine the children directly. Instead, Constance, with a calm and surprisingly detailed demeanor, would describe the symptoms and request very specific medications. She spoke with a knowledge of various childhood illnesses that was unusual for a layperson. When the doctor, following his professional duty and his Hippocratic oath, insisted on seeing his patients, Constance would patiently explain, with deep and sorrowful regret, that the children were simply too frightened of strangers, too deeply traumatized by their past experiences, to allow an examination by an unfamiliar man. It was for their own good, she would say. It was to protect their fragile, damaged minds. Dr. Whitfield, though finding the situation highly unusual, ultimately deferred to the judgment of the woman he believed to be their devoted and fiercely protective caregiver. The deception was so complete, so masterfully woven into the fabric of the community, that even the local pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, was a firm and vocal believer in the Sullivan family's charitable work. During his occasional visits to the farm for tea and polite conversation, Reverend Matthews would praise Constance and Ezra for their profound Christian compassion, for taking in so many of society's most unfortunate and forgotten children. He offered, on several occasions, to use his connections within the broader Methodist Church to help find permanent, loving homes for the orphans. But Constance would always politely and firmly decline his offer. She would explain that she was already in regular correspondence with relatives back in Pennsylvania, who would, eventually, take the children in. The process, she would assure him with a confident smile, simply required patience and a series of careful, delicate arrangements. What none of these people, the shopkeeper with his ledgers, the doctor with his medical bag, the pastor with his Bible, the neighbors with their quiet suspicions, what none of them could possibly realize was that Constance Sullivan had been perfecting her art of deception for over 2 decades. The orphan children were not temporary residents awaiting placement with loving families. They were prisoners. They were commodities. They had been purchased, kidnapped, or lured away from their own families across multiple states, and they were being held in conditions that would make even the most hardened criminals weep with horror. The children were not being prepared for new homes. They were the living, breathing inventory of a secret, thriving business. And the Sullivan farmhouse was not a sanctuary. It was a warehouse of human souls. The slow, inexorable unraveling of this web of lies, the series of seemingly unrelated incidents that would finally expose the Sullivan family's horrific secrets, began in the early, brutal months of 1834. February of that year had been unusually harsh, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks at a time. The bitter, unrelenting cold that gripped Virginia that winter would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the 47 children who were trapped in the perpetual darkness beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. It was a curse because their suffering, their hunger, their cold intensified. It was a blessing because the extreme weather would finally, after 20 years, force an outsider into their midst. On February 23, 1834, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was making his way from Richmond to Charlottesville when a violent, blinding snowstorm descended upon the region, forcing him to seek immediate shelter. The Sullivan farm, being the closest building visible from the road, seemed like a natural, logical choice for emergency accommodation. Ezra Sullivan, despite his obvious, almost palpable reluctance to let a stranger into his home, could hardly refuse hospitality to a stranded traveler during such dangerous weather. To do so would have been a grave violation of rural custom, an act so unusual that it would have drawn far more suspicion than simply letting him in for the night. Stern, in his later deposition to the sheriff, described the evening he spent at the farm as uncomfortably, almost unnervingly, tense. Constance Sullivan served a simple, meager meal of cornbread and salt pork, but the conversation was stilted and painfully awkward. The Sullivans seemed nervous, perpetually on edge, constantly exchanging furtive, worried glances and starting at every creak and groan of the old house in the howling wind. When Stern, in an attempt to make polite conversation, asked about the orphaned children he had heard they cared for, Constance was quick to explain that they were all sleeping soundly and absolutely mustn't be disturbed. The children, she said with a concerned frown, had been ill with a fever and desperately needed their rest. But what disturbed Stern the most, what kept him awake that night, was the sound. A sound that didn't fit with Constance's story. Throughout the long, cold night, as he lay on a makeshift bed in the Sullivans' parlor, he could hear what sounded like muffled, rhythmic crying coming from directly beneath the floorboards. It was a faint, sorrowful sound, almost like the whimpering of a small, wounded animal, a sound that seemed to rise up from the very earth itself. When he mentioned this to Ezra the next morning, Sullivan was quick with an explanation. It was probably just the wind, he claimed, whistling through the gaps in the old foundation. The sound was common in old houses, he said, especially during cold, windy weather. Stern, a man from the city, accepted this explanation, but something about the Sullivans' intense, almost fearful, manner continued to trouble him as he rode away into the snow-covered landscape. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that he had spent the night in a house that was actively holding a terrible, breathing secret. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later. On the 15th of March, a young Irish immigrant girl named Mary Catherine Flynn was traveling with her family to seek work in the vast tobacco fields around Richmond. During a chaotic crossing of a swollen river, she became separated from her group. Exhausted, frightened, and utterly alone, she made her way to the nearest sign of civilization, the Sullivan farm. As darkness fell, Constance Sullivan, with her soft, welcoming voice and kind, maternal eyes, took her in, offering the lost girl food and shelter for the night. Mary Catherine was never seen alive again. When her distraught family eventually reported her missing to the sheriff in Richmond, they described their last known location and the direction Mary Catherine had been heading. A search party was organized, but the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Virginia wilderness made finding a single missing person nearly impossible. The search was called off after a week, and Mary Catherine Flynn was officially presumed to have died of exposure or to have been killed by wild animals. Another forgotten tragedy, another lost soul swallowed by the harsh realities of the time. The final, decisive incident that would lead to the unmasking of the horror occurred on the 2nd of April, 1834. A local farmer named William Hutchinson was hunting rabbits in the dense woods that bordered the Sullivan property when he heard something that stopped him cold in his tracks. From somewhere near the Sullivan farmhouse came the unmistakable sound of children screaming. And this was not the ordinary, joyful cries of youngsters at play. These were raw, desperate, blood-curdling shrieks of pure, unadulterated terror. Hutchinson, a cautious but determined man, crept closer to investigate, hiding himself behind a thick stand of oak trees about 50 yards from the Sullivan house. For nearly an hour, he watched and he listened. The screaming continued intermittently, always seeming to come from beneath the house, from the ground itself rather than from inside it. At one point, he saw Ezra Sullivan emerge from what appeared to be a cellar door on the side of the house. Sullivan looked around nervously, his eyes darting back and forth across the empty fields. Then he disappeared back underground, closing the heavy door behind him. When Hutchinson reported what he had witnessed to his neighbors, opinions were sharply divided. Some suggested that the orphaned children the Sullivans cared for might be more troubled than had been let on, perhaps requiring harsh discipline or painful medical treatments that could be distressing. Others, however, began to connect the dots. They began to remember the odd, disparate details that hadn't seemed important before. The unusual, massive amounts of food Constance Sullivan purchased every 2 weeks. The strange hammering sounds that neighbors occasionally heard at night. The simple, chilling fact that none of the supposed orphans had ever, not once, been seen in town or at any of the community gatherings. A seed of doubt, once planted in the fertile ground of community gossip, began to grow rapidly into a tree of dark suspicion. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a veteran lawman who had served on Rico County for over 15 years, initially dismissed the growing concerns as little more than idle neighborhood gossip. He knew the Sullivans, or at least, he thought he did. They were respectable, charitable, church-going people. However, when William Hutchinson, a man known throughout the county for his sobriety and unwavering honesty, approached him directly and insisted on filing a formal, official complaint, Sheriff Crawford's sense of duty as a lawman took over. The law required him to follow up on credible reports of potential child abuse, regardless of his personal opinion of the accused. On the morning of the 8th of April, 1834, Sheriff Crawford rode out to the Sullivan farm, accompanied by his young but capable deputy, Marcus Webb. They arrived just after sunrise, fully expecting to conduct a routine and likely brief inspection that would quickly and quietly put the escalating community rumors to rest for good. Constance Sullivan met them at the door, her manner as calm, polite, and welcoming as ever. She invited the officers inside for coffee and expressed her own gentle concern and confusion about the unpleasant gossip that had been circulating in the community. The conversation began normally enough. Constance, with a practiced ease that came from 2 decades of deception, explained again about the orphan children. She showed the officers a stack of letters she claimed to have received from relatives in Pennsylvania, and even offered to arrange for the children to meet with Sheriff Crawford just as soon as they had fully recovered from their most recent bout of seasonal illness. Everything seemed perfectly plausible, perfectly reasonable, until Deputy Webb, on a hunch, asked to use the outhouse. As Webb walked around the side of the house, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cellar door, the very same one that William Hutchinson had seen Ezra Sullivan using, was secured with not 1, not 2, but 3 separate, heavy, rust-covered padlocks. Thick, greasy chains were wrapped around the wooden door handles, and the wood around the locks showed deep, desperate, frantic clawing marks, as if someone or something had tried to scratch their way out from the inside. When Webb returned to the house and quietly, urgently, informed Sheriff Crawford about what he had observed, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from polite inquiry to tense suspicion. Both men knew, in that gut-wrenching moment, that they were dealing with something far more serious, far more sinister than simple community gossip. Crawford, his voice now laced with a new, steely authority that he had not used before, politely but firmly asked Constance to show them the cellar, explaining that a thorough inspection would be the quickest and most effective way to put all the rumors to rest. The change in Constance Sullivan's demeanor was immediate and chilling. Her face went pale, a mask of controlled, rising panic. Her hands, which had been calmly resting in her lap, began to tremble uncontrollably, and she began stammering, weaving a frantic, disjointed story about how the cellar was dangerous, how it was structurally unsound, how the children were strictly forbidden from going down there, how there was absolutely nothing to see but old, broken farm equipment and dusty storage jars. And that was when they heard it, from somewhere deep beneath their feet, from the very ground they stood upon, came the unmistakable sound of children crying, followed by a weak, faint, desperate voice calling for help. The sound was muffled by the thick wooden floorboards, but it was undeniable, and it was coming from directly below the kitchen where they stood. The charade was over. The truth, in all its horror, was about to be unearthed. The immediate aftermath of that first, terrible discovery would haunt Sheriff Crawford for the rest of his life. When he and Deputy Webb finally, with considerable force, broke open the cellar door, the stench that rose up from the darkness below was overwhelming, a physical, tangible assault on the senses. It was a vile, gag-inducing mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, stale, damp air, and something else. Something that Crawford later described in his official report as the very smell of despair itself. The basement that Ezra Sullivan had spent over 2 decades constructing was not a cellar. It was a dungeon, a meticulously engineered masterpiece of calculated, systematic cruelty. The main chamber stretched far beyond the footprint of the house above, extending deep into the earth like an underground warren of human misery. Thick stone walls, carefully mortared and clearly designed to muffle and contain sound, created a series of interconnected, lightless, tomb-like rooms. The largest chamber, located directly beneath the kitchen, housed most of the children. They were chained to heavy iron rings that had been embedded deep into the cold, damp stone walls. Each child was secured by heavy iron shackles fastened around their ankles. The chains were just long enough to allow them to sit or lie down within a small, prescribed area, but they prevented any possibility of meaningful interaction, of human comfort, of escape. The children, 47 of them, were shockingly emaciated, their bodies little more than skin and bone, their clothes reduced to filthy, rotting rags. Their skin, pale and translucent from a lack of sunlight, bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged, horrific neglect and abuse. Many showed clear signs of advanced illness, raging fevers, severe respiratory problems, and painful skin conditions. But what struck both of the hardened lawmen most forcefully, what would forever be seared into their memories, was the silence. After those initial, hopeful cries for help, the children said nothing. They simply stared at the newcomers with wide, vacant, hollow eyes. Eyes that held no hope, no expectation of rescue, only a profound, soul-deep, and terrifying weariness. Deputy Webb, a father of 4 young children himself, had to leave the basement twice to vomit in the yard, his body unable to contain the horror his mind was trying to process. Sheriff Crawford, despite his many years of law enforcement experience, found himself psychologically unable to comprehend the full scope of what he was seeing. In the smaller, ancillary chambers, Crawford and Webb found more evidence of the Sullivans' meticulous and cruel system of control. One room contained stocks and other restraining devices, clearly used for punishment. Another held what appeared to be a primitive medical area, where the children were clearly treated for injuries and illnesses, not out of compassion, but simply to keep the merchandise alive. A third room, the most damning of all, contained a collection of detailed, leather-bound ledgers. The records revealed the horrifying, decades-long scope of the Sullivan operation. Children had been arriving at the farm regularly, like clockwork, since the year 1812. The sources of these children varied. Some were orphans, purchased for a pittance from overwhelmed poorhouses. Others were runaways, lured from the streets by false promises. And still others, the records seemed to suggest, appeared to have been simply kidnapped from their families, stolen like property. The ledgers showed that over the years, more than 90 children had passed through the Sullivan basement. 90. The obvious, terrifying question, what had happened to the others, the ones who were no longer present, was answered in the most horrifying way imaginable. In a separate, cleverly hidden chamber reached through a narrow passage, Crawford and Webb found the shallow graves, the small, fragile bones of at least 36 children, buried in the hard-packed dirt floor, their bodies hastily covered with lime to control the odor of decay. The Sullivans' charitable work was not just imprisonment and abuse, it was a death camp in miniature. The investigation that followed this initial, horrific discovery would continue for many months, as authorities struggled to comprehend how such a massive criminal enterprise could have operated completely undetected for over 2 decades. The answer lay in Constance Sullivan's unique, terrifying genius for deception and her chillingly astute understanding of human psychology. She had created a public persona perfectly designed to avoid suspicion. The character of the charitable woman caring for orphans appealed to the community's Christian values, while conveniently explaining away any unusual aspects of the Sullivan household. The tragic story of traumatized children provided a ready excuse for why the supposed orphans were never seen in public. Even more cleverly, Constance had created multiple layers of protection for her dark operation. The children were systematically taught to call her mother, ensuring that if anyone ever happened to overhear them, it would seem like a natural, loving relationship. The few times that children had been glimpsed by outsiders, they had been terrifyingly coached to remain absolutely silent and appear shy. The physical setup was equally well planned. The basement construction had been spread out over many years, with different workers handling isolated aspects of the project. The thick stone walls were effective soundproofing, so even the closest neighbors rarely heard anything suspicious. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the intricate and cruel psychological control system that Constance had developed. The children were told, relentlessly, that they had been abandoned by their own families and that the outside world was a far more dangerous place than their basement prison. Those who behaved were given slightly better food. Those who showed defiance were subjected to brutal, public punishments that served as terrifying examples to the others. Over time, worn down by hunger, fear, and utter hopelessness, most of the children had come to accept their captivity as their reality. The community's reaction to the discovery was one of complete, staggering disbelief. Many residents initially refused to believe that Constance Sullivan, the quiet, respectable woman who had lived among them for over 20 years, could possibly be capable of such monstrous acts. But these denials became impossible to maintain as more irrefutable evidence emerged. The detailed records found in the basement included a hidden trove of correspondence with a network of criminal contacts in other states. Constance Sullivan had not been acting alone. She was a key and apparently highly respected player in a sprawling web of evil that trafficked in children, buying and selling young, vulnerable victims across state lines. The Sullivan farm was just one particularly horrific operation in a much larger and much more terrifying criminal enterprise. As Sheriff Crawford delved deeper, disturbing patterns began to emerge. The correspondence found in the basement revealed that Constance Sullivan had been in regular, coded contact with at least 12 other individuals spread across 5 states. The letters, written in a simple substitution code, discussed merchandise deliveries, shipping logistics, and quality control in a cold, detached language that, once understood, clearly referred to the buying and selling of human beings. The financial records painted an even more horrifying picture. Constance Sullivan had been paying, on average, between $50 and $200 per child, depending on their age and health. She had also been receiving substantial payments from other, unknown locations, suggesting that the Sullivan farm served as both a final destination for some children and a temporary holding point for others who were trafficked further south. This was the cold, calculated work of a successful and ruthless businesswoman whose product was human flesh. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician, now racked with guilt, became a key witness. He revealed that Constance Sullivan had always been unusually specific about the medication she requested. She possessed a detailed knowledge of how to treat malnutrition, respiratory infections, and other conditions common in severely neglected children. She had also, he now realized with sickening horror, asked for regular supplies of sedatives and other powerful drugs that could be used to control rebellious prisoners. Constance had been systematically studying how to keep large numbers of children alive under conditions of the most extreme deprivation, not out of cruelty, but out of a terrifying efficiency. The investigation also finally revealed the precise role of Ezra Sullivan. While Constance was the mastermind, Ezra was the muscle. He was responsible for the physical maintenance of the prison and for the brutal, day-to-day handling of the children. Several survivors described him as the enforcer, the one who carried out the punishments that kept them all in a state of constant fear. His continuous construction work on the basement had been the constant refinement of a system designed to hold human beings in permanent, hopeless captivity. The breakthrough that would lead to the exposure of the entire network came from an unexpected source. Among the survivors was a girl named Rebecca, approximately 14 years old. Unlike most of the other children, who were psychologically shattered, Rebecca had maintained a fierce will to survive and an extraordinary photographic memory. Rebecca had been kidnapped from her family's farm in Pennsylvania in 1829. She remembered everything: a well-dressed woman claiming to be a relative, promises of sweets, and waking up, hours later, chained in the darkness of the Sullivan basement. More importantly, she remembered conversations she had overheard between Constance Sullivan and the mysterious visitors who had come to the farm over the years. Her testimony was a bombshell. It revealed that the Sullivan operation was just one small part of a much larger, more powerful network. She had heard Constance discussing other farms where children were being held. She remembered names, dates, and chillingly casual details about shipments of children being moved between facilities, as if they were livestock. The most damning revelation came when Rebecca described a visit from a wealthy man. Just weeks before the discovery, the man, she recalled, had inspected them carefully, checking their teeth and muscle tone like a buyer evaluating livestock at a market. The visitor had ultimately decided not to purchase any of the children, complaining they were too damaged, but he had left behind a letter. This letter, found filed among Constance Sullivan's papers, described chilling requirements for children of specific ages and characteristics. The letter was signed H. Blackwood with a return address in Charleston, South Carolina. When authorities in South Carolina investigated, they discovered that Henry Blackwood was a wealthy and influential plantation owner. An investigation into his affairs soon revealed that he had been purchasing children for years, for purposes that would soon be revealed as even more sinister than the horrors of the Sullivan operation. The Blackwood connection opened up a new, horrifying dimension. It appeared that wealthy Southern plantation owners had been using this trafficking network to acquire a specific type of worker, one who would be completely under their control, with no rights, no family, and no identity. Unlike the enslaved people who worked their fields, these trafficked children were ghosts. They were invisible. They had no families to search for them and no hope of escape. They could be worked to death, tortured, or killed with virtually no legal consequences for their owners. The investigation into Blackwood quickly revealed that several other prominent Southern families had been involved in similar purchases. As the true scope of this criminal network became clear, the investigation began to face increasing and dangerous resistance from powerful, unseen interests. Threats were made against the investigators and the witnesses. Sheriff Crawford received anonymous letters warning him to drop the investigation. Deputy Webb was viciously attacked by unknown assailants. The situation became even more dangerous when one of the surviving children, a key witness, disappeared from the supposedly secure shelter where he was being housed. He was never found. The pressure reached its peak when Constance Sullivan herself was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but the circumstances were profoundly suspicious. She had been scheduled to testify the very next week about the full extent of the criminal network, a testimony that would have included the names of all of her high-profile customers. Her death conveniently and permanently eliminated the investigation's most important witness. Just when it seemed the investigation might be derailed, a former employee of Henry Blackwood, an overseer named Samuel Pierce, came forward with evidence that would blow the case wide open. Pierce, risking his own life, had detailed first-hand knowledge of the children who had been purchased from the Sullivan network. Pierce's testimony before the federal grand jury in Richmond was one of the most disturbing accounts ever delivered in an American legal proceeding. He described in chilling detail how the Blackwood plantation operated in experimental quarters where the trafficked children were used as unwilling subjects for a series of grotesque and sadistic medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and several of his associates, including to highly respected physicians from the Charleston Medical College. The experiments were designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance, to study the effects of various untested drugs, and to satisfy the perverse scientific curiosity of men who viewed these children as nothing more than disposable laboratory animals. Pierce's testimony revealed that at least 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sold directly to Blackwood over the years. Of these, only 4 had survived. The rest had died, either as a direct result of the horrific experiments or from the brutal conditions in the experimental quarters. Their small bodies had been unceremoniously buried in unmarked graves on the vast plantation. Armed with Pierce's damning information, the investigation team coordinated a series of dramatic, simultaneous raids on multiple locations across the South. Over 100 additional children were rescued from various facilities. A mountain of physical evidence was seized, and several prominent, powerful individuals were arrested, including Henry Blackwood himself, the 2 physicians, and a state legislator from Georgia who had been one of the network's best customers. The evidence seized painted a picture of systematic, organized evil that shocked the nation to its core. The trafficking network, it was now clear, had been operating for over 30 years, had involved dozens of major buyers and sellers, and had victimized hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent children. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for many years. The sheer complexity of the case, combined with the immense wealth and powerful political connections of many of the defendants, made prosecution extremely difficult. Ezra Sullivan, who had been captured during the initial raid, was convicted on multiple charges of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and murder. He was executed by hanging in the public square in Richmond on November 15, 1836. Henry Blackwood's trial became a national sensation. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, but he eventually died in prison in 1841, reportedly of a heart attack, though many suspected he had been poisoned by former associates who feared he might reveal additional secrets. The 2 physicians from Charleston were expelled from the medical profession and sentenced to long prison terms. Their cases led to new, strict regulations governing medical research and the ethical treatment of human subjects. The most frustrating aspect of the investigation was the number of powerful individuals who ultimately escaped justice, despite clear evidence of their involvement. Several wealthy plantation owners fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political connections to avoid prosecution altogether. The surviving children, of course, faced a long, arduous path to recovery. Most had been held captive for years and had no clear memory of life before their imprisonment. Rebecca, the girl whose testimony had been so crucial, was, against all odds, able to build a relatively normal life for herself. She lived to be 73 years old, marrying and raising a family of her own. But after her powerful trial testimony, she never spoke publicly about her experiences ever again. The case led to significant and lasting nationwide reforms in child welfare and protection. The state of Virginia passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in American history, establishing government oversight of all orphanages. Other states quickly followed suit, creating the foundation for our modern child welfare systems. The federal government also responded with new laws addressing interstate crimes and human trafficking. Perhaps most importantly, the case fundamentally changed public awareness about the vulnerability of children. The romantic notion of the charitable individual caring for orphans was forever replaced by a more realistic understanding of the need for government oversight and legal safeguards. The Sullivan farm itself became a permanent, dark symbol of the horrors that had been uncovered. The house was demolished in 1845, and the basement, the scene of so much suffering, was filled with concrete and permanently sealed, a tomb for its own dark history. The case stands as both a chilling testament to the almost limitless depths of human evil, and a powerful, hopeful reminder of the power of individual conscience to overcome even the most entrenched systems of abuse. This mystery shows us that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the most horrific crimes can be committed by those who appear most normal. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or are there still secrets buried deep in the Virginia hills? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of American history has many more secrets to reveal, and we'll be here to uncover them all. See you in the next one.